Thanks for tuning in today, everybody. I'm so delighted to be joined by Dr. Dominic. Dominic, thank you so much for coming on for our session this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So Dominic has a wide wealth of experience. He's senior psychology lecturer and also specializes then in the maths anxiety space, which will be a little bit of today's topic around how to manage that process for yourself or for somebody you know. And, we'll dive into that a little bit more. Dominic, would you like to maybe give a little bit of a background and an overview as to kind of how you've ended up in this space initially for some of our viewers?
Yeah, thanks, Una. So I started researching maths anxiety in my final year as an undergraduate psychology student at the University of Derby, and that's where I still am. And I went on to look at this in my master's and my PhD. My focus for my PhD was to identify what underpins maths anxiety in the early ages, because when I started that work, previous research hadn't necessarily looked at it, particularly from a UK perspective. So we ultimately looked at that. We explored that area. We had interviews. We conducted interviews with children, parents, teachers, maths experts. We got a whole wide perspective of what underpins anxiety and maths experiences for children. And then we used that data to develop the Children's Maths Anxiety Scale UK. So it's a research scale that practitioners can use to identify children that are at risk of developing maths anxiety. So that's a free resource which is available to all practitioners. It's accessible through our Maths Anxiety Research Group website at the University of Derby. But since doing my PhD, I've been part of works to explore maths anxiety in children further. So my focus is really at looking at maths anxiety in children and their experiences. And now we're trying to focus more on what we can do about it. So functional approaches, cost effective, long-term viable approaches. And we've been trialing those in research, looking as well at emotion regulation, relaxation strategies, alternative pedagogical approaches as well. So our research is more geared towards now what can we do about it, as opposed to just identifying it and showing that it exists. We already know that now. So what can we do about it to try and alleviate that? So that's kind of been the trajectory of my research in this area. It started off as the PhD, but since that, it's now geared towards trying to implement these functional approaches to better support children in the early years, so that we're working towards more prevention rather than trying to cure it later on. Because at that stage, unfortunately, maths anxiety can be quite rigid. It can be, people can be set in their ways. They can already be quite avoidant of it. It can already have affected their performance quite deeply. So that's what we're trying to do for the research that we're doing at the moment.
Amazing. And as you mentioned, that intervention piece is crucial. And I suppose when we work with students, even younger kids or, older teenagers or even adults, they may have, as you mentioned, like different kind of traumatic maths experiences, but even educational experiences. And I suppose maybe it's best to maybe split them into two, Dominic, maybe from, let's say, a school and a home base, because obviously that's where maybe most of this will resonate at home, doing homework or doing activities, and then at school in a teacher context. Any kind of advice or suggestions you might have to teachers trying to obviously manage a cohort of students and then, not sure of maths anxiety signs or what things that might help in let's say, a classroom setting?
Sure. So signs in the classroom would be avoidance. And avoidance can take many forms. That could be disruptive behavior. It could be complete withdrawal. It could be you might even see clear physiological signs. The child might go red. They might start sweating. They, physically they may look nervous. They may look startled and just completely disrupted by the maths experience. We know that maths does this to children. So, and as part of what we know as the negative cycle, it's the poor preparation, which perhaps links to the previous avoidance of the subject, and then children just don't want to do it. They get away from it. It affects their performance. That low performance um, leads to sort of negative feedback from their work. So then they want to avoid it more. So it's poor preparation. So they get stuck in that negative cycle. And that's what we're trying to avoid through the approaches that we're trialing. But for teachers, really the early signs, those early indicators, it is the avoidance of maths, or perhaps children trying to rely on other children to support them, looking for those coping strategies to manage the anxiety, to manage the situation. From the time I spent working in schools as a high level teaching assistant, I saw from the age of 4 to 5 all the way up to age 16, children and young people coming up with very elaborate methods to escape and to avoid the math scenario. So those are the signs for teachers to look out for. Um,
Amazing, yeah. And as
yeah.
you mentioned, there are things to like cues. How is their reactions, and what kind of is illustrated as maybe a possible response. Both visually, and then obviously, as we know, there's a lot of masking and internal things that we can't see either. And when maybe they spot some of those, Dominic, what like is the suitable reaction, or what might be some teachers' next steps at that stage, do you think?
Well, research has demonstrated the benefits of things like simple to implement viable approaches, which I've spoke about, techniques, and those might include things like breathing techniques. And that actually makes a lot of sense when we think about the cognitive triangle. So something that your listeners may be familiar with, the cognitive triangle, and how our thoughts, how our feelings, our behaviors are all linked together. And in maths, if a learner is feeling anxious, they might start to feel overwhelmed. They start to experience that panic and almost that mental paralysis that maths can induce, that maths anxiety. So they might start to behave in ways that will help them to avoid the stress. So, like we've been talking about, the avoidance, and that could be a complete avoidance, and they might become disruptive, and so on. So, from my experience of working in schools, like I've said, I've seen children do that. So, breathing techniques, it's cost effective. It could be a viable approach, and it can allow that space for a learner to collect their thoughts. And to appraise a situation in a more measured way, and essentially help them to refocus their thoughts. So breathing techniques such as inhaling through the nose for 4 seconds and then holding it for 4 seconds and then releasing for 4 seconds can be quite a simple but very effective approach. Especially if we're trying to encourage sort of simultaneous positive thoughts about a maths task, such as, I can do this. It's a challenge, and that obviously links to things like a growth mindset as well. So just things like that, simple relaxation techniques, breathing techniques can help to immediately relax a student that's perhaps starting to display signs of maths anxiety, that avoidance or that distress. So things like that, but there's other things that we can do as well. There's other approaches that we could do, perhaps to be more proactive, particularly around different pedagogical approaches as well.
Amazing, yeah, and I suppose those intervention or those practical things, Dominic, I'm sure are massively useful as to, okay, well, we see this or we're unsure of this, and how do we respond maybe and provide that safety base for a student in a classroom context, which for most, regardless of age group, is generally busy. There's generally stuff going on,
Absolutely.
so there's lots of other aspects to it, and they may have more neurodiverse aspects as well underneath the surface. And from a home base, then, Dominic, maybe from a parent linking in with a student or a teenager, and this is a daily or a weekly struggle, what maybe suggestions might be quite useful for them to implement to help their child thrive and develop in this space?
Sure. So we, as maths anxiety researchers, always say that just learning about what maths anxiety is and how it can impact someone, particularly at the cognitive level, is like an intervention in itself. It can really make someone stop and become more self-aware, and it can then start to support their own emotion regulation if they think, actually, this is how I feel when I do maths. This is how it can impact me cognitively, and this is perhaps what I could do to start trying to manage that, because I think sometimes people experience maths anxiety. Lots of learners, including myself, experience maths anxiety at school without ever knowing what it was. And that's why people can perceive it to be more of an intellectual based issue rather than an emotional issue. And it's the extreme emotional responses and that processing of those emotions that disrupts us at the cognitive level. So if we can calm down the emotional response, we often see an underlying ability. So anything we can do to emotionally regulate an individual is always going to help them to be more cognitively available for the task itself. So there's lots of approaches. We have in research been trialing therapy dog approaches. There's a storybook approach as well. That's based on the principles of an approach called bibliotherapy. We know through research as well that expressive writing can be helpful. So if we have someone that is struggling with maths, we might say to them, okay, before we do this maths work or before we do this maths test, write down how you're feeling about it. And research has shown that expressive writing before engaging with maths can often support someone's performance in the subject. So there's lots of things we can do, but generally eliminating myths around maths. So there's been, historically this myth that boys are better at maths than girls, which has thankfully been absolutely smashed by STEM initiatives, which is great to see. But we have to try and eliminate myths because we still see in research that girls will react differently to maths. Perhaps they recoil more at it. We see this still in research evidence. So we still need to break down those myths. Unfortunately, children can absorb that. We know that children can absorb negative feelings from others as well. So when thinking about how parents can support children, it's to avoid any negative comments around the subject, any disdain towards maths, even if someone or an adult has struggled previously with maths and had their own negative experiences. When working with children and supporting their children, it's just to say, oh, maths is exciting, isn't it? Oh, maths can be really fun. Oh, that's a little bit tricky, but we can do it, or we can work it out. Things like that, because otherwise children absorb those negative feelings, and then they'll relay them as excuses for why they can't do maths. I was speaking to a teacher in a study, and who said that, at parents' evening, the parent said in front of the child, "Oh, they won't be good at maths because I couldn't do maths." And then later that week, the child said, when they stopped engaging with maths, "Oh, it doesn't matter anyway because my parents didn't like maths." And research tells us that children absorb everything they hear. And when it comes to maths talk, they, that negativity can transfer to children, and then they can become fearful of it as well. So we have to be really, really careful about what we say around children, and to promote the more positive approaches around maths.
Completely. Yeah. And as you were saying there, Dominic, about the mindset of how you approach it, and that, yes, it is challenging. So not to undermine the level of maybe, internal feelings that they have, but it's also somewhat doable, or we just need to find out a new way of doing it. And I suppose the question we get, I'd say maybe every day when we work with a student is, why do we need this? What use does this have? Why do I need to do all of my algebraic equations and then, do some of them on a calculator, some of them not? What impact do these have in, real life context? And I suppose, yes, there's some aspect of that too, that, it isn't maybe as fitting with the current trajectory of society. However, nonetheless, from an Irish base, we still need to do maths to move through school. So unfortunately, it is still compulsory, regardless of the kind of pros and cons for it or against it. It's still
Sure.
an essential part of the curriculum, really.
Yeah. And it's yeah, and even things like even techniques that can be used at home or even in school as well. It's, asking a child, okay, describe that question in your own understanding. So tell me, so you're at, so, and that can help you to find potentially where they're misunderstanding. that can be a useful technique as well. But maybe using practical resources, more tangible resources rather than maths being abstract and in our heads, which can be tricky for some. Using resources that are tangible that people can work with and manipulate, that can help to make something a little bit more understandable and not just this abstract thing, these numbers that float around in space. That could be really helpful. So anything at home that can be used to, whether it's footballs or barbecue coated little peanuts, anything like that can be used, that's going to be great. Gamification as well. So making it into an exploratory, fun-based activity, making a game out of maths, we know can be really, really effective as well. So these are all different things that we can do, as parents, as practitioners. Let's make it fun. Let's make it engaging. And let's try and make it relevant to the real world as well. So use examples, and maybe draw on the interests of the child. So if they're interested in football or ice skating or anything like that, use those examples, draw it in, and make it more relevant to them so they can start to see the real world applications. Because obviously
Totally.
maths is central to everything that we do, and it helps us to build those academic skills as well, like critical thinking, logical thinking, and so on. So it's really central to so many skills that we develop and lots of areas of career opportunity. So the more we can integrate that into children's every day, and the more they can engage with it in a fun way, I suppose, that's ultimately going to be beneficial for them in the long term. So
Amazing, yeah. And as you said, those tangible things, we've lots of kids maybe in the younger years might struggle with money and counting money, but lots of it's all visual representation in a book, so maybe integrating those and actually having the physical change while they're doing the sums and having those, as you said, tangible aspects. It's not that far-reaching concept. How do we, and telling the time has been a massive, massive challenge for some kids. So how do we integrate more things that we can maybe touch or see or look at instead of just traditionally looking at a book or looking at a computer screen if the homework is online and those strands.
yeah, and that's where the fun can be lost as well, can't it? And maths is supposed to be an exploratory based fun thing for people to engage in. And sometimes we can have quite rigid rules around maths, which can
Mhm.
lead to the anxiety as well, because it can take out the personal exploration of what can I do with these numbers and how can I work these different ways to get to that same solution. And sometimes we can be so fixed on no, stay within this narrow corridor. It takes out that individuality, and so uh you know it's all about making it fun. And I know this all potentially sounds quite idealistic, and but it's that's what we're trying to do, is trying to make it fun and for people and children to want to engage with the subject so that they can do their best at it, and so that it doesn't become something which is perceived as scary or as causing anxiety.
Completely. And maybe we'll wrap up on our last question, Dominic, about, lengthy word problems. You mentioned there about asking a child, okay, what's your interpretation of that? And most of questions that we get from parents is they find, maths when they get into it, they're great. But as we kind of move through the school system, we have all those longer and longer sentences, and it's English based linked in. And again, maybe there is or overlaps there with other learning dimensions and other learning difficulties. What advice might you give to, either parents, students, or even the teacher, themselves as to, okay, if they're really struggling, trying to grasp this concept, they may eventually know how to do the sum, but they're trying to figure out what are the key points or what are the key things asking for. How do we move around that, and how do we help a child or a student understand maths questions?
Okay, so for those long worded questions, obviously potentially as well for children, there's that difference, that variability in reading ability and comprehension as well. So maybe that we need to read it to them a few times. We could also ask them to explain the question, to read the question, and then explain it to us in their own understanding. What do they think are the key points? To make it a little bit more tangible as well, why don't they highlight the key points in the question if they can? And then we can maybe start to draw out, so they could draw what they think the question is telling them. So we can use these different approaches, these different techniques to try and make the processing more deeper rather than just reading the question. So what can we do to make it more tangible? Some people learn better from seeing things or from drawing things out. So we can support children by doing that. We could ask them to do that for us. So explain to me, why don't you draw for me what you think this question is telling me, or what, how many do you think we have? Um, it's how I teach some of my students for the modules that I teach at the university. I'll explain information around an assessment, but then I'll also have a visual representation or a diagram to show that. So when we are looking at these long-worded questions, it's important to help our children or students to pick out that key information. That becomes a key skill in itself, isn't it? Drawing out, what's this question telling me? What do I need to focus on here? And of course, seeing lots of words for some people can be tricky. I think I fall into that category. So I do like to see visuals and different ways of representing that information. And when I'm planning out a study design, for instance, I won't just write it on a Word document. I'll start to map it out. I'll draw it. So I think these are nice techniques that we can support children with, and also and start to promote that independent use of those skills as well, so that they just use that as their go-to, their default approach is to, okay, pick out the key information, highlight it, start drawing out, what can I do here? And it links to metacognitive approaches as well, where they can learn how best they learn and start to implement those approaches, and that sort of wraps into emotion regulation as well, and supporting them. If they can do that when they read a question, they think, okay, that's a potentially uh, difficult, maybe a scary question. I can feel myself getting a bit nervous by that. I need to just calm, think about it, and then approach it using these techniques that my parents have showed me or my teacher's been showing me. Then that's a step towards being able to better to regulate and to approach maths in a more confident and a more of a growth mindset way.
Exactly. And as you were saying there, Dominic, about breaking down the questions, and we find often that element of, okay, breaking down and double checking or going back, which often can be time consuming initially, particularly for students if they're doing homework on top of a long school day. So it can be definitely a tough process, but we find student might jump in straight away. They might see something familiar and maybe opt for some bit of a conclusion, and then may come up with a different answer than maybe what was asked in the question. So as you mentioned, maybe drawing things out, or doing, a brief initial analysis. Okay, maybe they're asking this, and then reviewing it to double check and to make sure before we get 5-10 minutes
Yeah.
into doing the sum, and then realize, oh, actually this isn't what they wanted. So it's that maybe re-emphasis of what is being asked as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of approaches, isn't there? But yeah, I think those are just touching on some of them. But I think the
Completely.
key ones are things like the expressive writing, the relaxation techniques, just obviously just summarizing some of the things we've talked about, the gamification as well, making it fun and exploratory based. So yeah, there's lots of different approaches that can be trialed just to make it
Amazing.
more engaging, because the more students engage with it, in a nutshell, the more they engage with maths, the more likely they are to stick with it. The
Yes.
real risk is the avoidance, as I mentioned at the very start of our chat. It's when they become avoidant of maths, they fall behind conceptually, then the performance is affected, and then they avoid it more, and then that negative cycle really sets in. So it's the avoidance ultimately we want to avoid. Even if they're engaging, but they're still struggling to an extent, but they want to keep going back to it and trying, they'll get there. But
Yes.
once someone avoids it and becomes avoidant of it and they withdraw, then that's challenging to get them to come back. So it's the avoidance that we want to stop.
Completely. Thank you. And I'm sure for all our listeners, such a fabulous overview of both science and intervention techniques, and for home and school. So we really appreciate your insights, Dominic, and we look forward to learning about all of your future discoveries, so that we can share them over across the water. But thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Una.